The first time I saw Jake Holloway, he was standing in the dying Texas sunlight outside Murphy's Hardware, all 6'7" of him, and I knew my carefully constructed world was about to crack wide open. My name is Grace Elizabeth Morrison, and for 23 years, I've been exactly who everyone expected me to be. The preacher's daughter. The girl who taught Sunday school, organized church bake sales, and never, ever colored outside the lines. My father stood at the pulpit every Sunday morning in our small town of Redemption Creek, preaching about righteousness and restraint, and I sat in the front pew, nodding along like a well-trained sentinel of propriety. But that afternoon, watching Jake load bags of feed into his battered pickup truck, his weathered cowboy hat casting shadows across a face that looked like it had stories to tell, stories nothing like the sanitized ones I'd grown up with, something inside me whispered a dangerous question: what if there's more? Jake had drifted into Redemption Creek 3 months earlier, taking work at the Henderson Ranch on the outskirts of town. He was a man of few words and fewer smiles, but when he did smile, it was like watching the sun break through storm clouds. The town gossips had plenty to say about him, a drifter with no roots, probably running from something, definitely not the kind of man a respectable girl should notice. Which is precisely why I couldn't stop noticing him. Grace. My mother's voice cut through my thoughts. She stood by our car, grocery bags in hand, eyebrows raised in that way that said she'd caught me staring. We need to get home. Your father has the deacons coming for dinner. I nodded obediently, as I always did, and climbed into the car. But as we pulled away, I caught Jake's eyes in the side mirror. He'd been watching me too. The weeks that followed were torture. I'd see him at the general store, at the post office, once at the diner where I waitressed on weekday afternoons to save money for the teaching degree my parents had planned out for me. Each encounter was brief, proper, completely innocent. We'd exchange polite nods, maybe a "afternoon, ma'am," from him that made my heart perform acrobatics. But there was something in those brief moments, a recognition, perhaps, that we were both wearing costumes. His was the silent drifter who kept everyone at arm's length. Mine was the perfect daughter who never questioned, never wanted, never yearned for anything beyond the narrow path laid out before her. The night everything changed started like any other Wednesday. Youth group had just ended, and I was locking up the church fellowship hall when I heard the commotion. Raised voices carried from the parking lot, my father's voice, stern and condemning, and another voice, quieter but firm. Jake's voice. I hurried outside to find them facing off under the flickering parking lot light. My father's face was red with righteous anger, and beside him stood Marcus Chen, our church treasurer, looking uncomfortable. "We don't need your charity," my father was saying, his voice tight. Especially not from someone who probably came by it through questionable means. I'd never seen my father like this, so harsh, so immediately judgmental. Jake stood there, hat in his hands, a white envelope extended toward them. "It's not charity, preacher. It's just. I heard about the roof fund falling short. The church has been good to me, letting me sit in the back on Sundays. Figured I'd give something back." His voice was gentle, patient, even in the face of my father's hostility. "We don't take money from strangers," my father insisted. "Especially not ones who show up out of nowhere with no explanation, no history, no." "Stop." The word escaped my lips before I could catch it. Both men turned to look at me, shock written across their faces. I never interrupted my father. Never contradicted him. Never spoke out of turn. But something in me had finally reached its breaking point. "Daddy, he's trying to help. Why does it matter where he came from?" My voice shook, but I held my ground. My father's eyes narrowed. "Grace Elizabeth, this is not your concern. Go home." "No." Another word I'd never said to him. "I'm tired of pretending we're better than everyone else just because we're scared of people we don't understand." The silence that followed was deafening. My father looked like I'd slapped him. Marcus Chen suddenly found the ground fascinating. And Jake was staring at me with something that looked like respect, maybe even admiration. "I'll drive you home, Grace," my father finally said, his voice cold and controlled. "We'll discuss this there." But I shook my head. "I'll walk. I need some air." I turned and walked away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. I just committed the ultimate rebellion, not sneaking out to a party, not experimenting with forbidden things, but something far more terrifying. I'd spoken my truth. I'd made it maybe 3 blocks when I heard the rumble of a truck engine slowing beside me. Jake's pickup pulled up, and he leaned across the seat to push open the passenger door. "Mighty long walk to the edge of town in the dark," he said quietly. "Could use some company for a drive, if you're interested." This was the moment. The choice. I could be the good girl who walked home alone, who apologized to her father, who slipped back into the comfortable cage of expectation. Or I could take a different path, not a path of rebellion for rebellion's sake, but a path toward my own truth. I climbed into the truck. We drove in silence for a while, leaving the town lights behind, heading toward the open country where the stars spread out like diamonds on black velvet. Finally, Jake pulled over at a spot overlooking Henderson's ranch, killed the engine, and turned to me. "You didn't have to do that back there," he said. "Stand up for me." "Yes, I did," I replied, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "Because it was wrong. And I'm tired of staying silent about wrong things just because speaking up isn't ladylike or proper or whatever I'm supposed to be." Jake studied me for a long moment, and then he did something unexpected. He laughed, a real, genuine laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deep and previously locked away. "You want to know why I really came to Redemption Creek?" he asked. I nodded, and he began to tell me his story. Not the mysterious drifter tale the town had invented, but the real one. He'd been a veterinarian in Denver, successful and established, until his wife died in a car accident 2 years ago. The grief had been unbearable, suffocating. He'd walked away from everything, his practice, his life, his identity, and just started driving. He'd been looking for redemption, he said, which is why he'd stopped when he'd seen the town's name on a road sign. "Working with my hands, with animals, in the quiet, it's been healing," he explained. "And your father's sermons, even though he doesn't know it, they've helped too. Not the judgment parts, but when he talks about grace and second chances. When he talks about the God who seeks out the lost." I felt tears on my cheeks. "I'm sorry about your wife. And I'm sorry I got you in trouble with your father." "I got myself in trouble," I said, wiping my eyes. "And honestly, it feels like the first honest thing I've done in years." We sat there talking for hours, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't performing the role of preacher's daughter. I was just Grace, with my own thoughts, my own doubts, my own dreams that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations. Jake shared more about his journey through grief, about slowly learning to live again. I shared my fear of disappointing everyone, my terror of wanting something different than what had been prescribed for me. As the night deepened, Jake reached across the truck's bench seat and took my hand. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt revolutionary. "Grace," he said softly, "I don't know what this is or what it means. But I do know that watching you stand up for what's right, even when it was hard, that was one of the bravest things I've ever seen." I looked at our joined hands, then up at his face, and I made another choice, not the wild, reckless choice that good girls supposedly avoid, but something equally powerful. I chose honesty. "I want to know you," I said. "The real you, not the mysterious cowboy the town gossips about. And I want you to know the real me, not the perfect preacher's daughter." "Is that forbidden?" Jake smiled, and it was like sunrise. "Only if we let it be." The drive back to town felt both too short and eternal. Jake dropped me off a block from my house, but before I got out, he said something that would echo in my mind for days: real goodness isn't about following rules. It's about following your conscience, even when it's terrifying. I walked into my house expecting fireworks, but instead found something more painful: disappointed silence. My mother had already gone to bed. My father sat in his study, his Bible open before him, but I could tell he wasn't reading. "Daddy," I said from the doorway. He looked up, and the hurt in his eyes nearly broke me. "I don't know who you were tonight, Grace, but it wasn't the daughter I raised." The old me would have crumbled, apologized, promised to do better. But something had shifted. "Maybe it's exactly the daughter you raised," I said gently. "You taught me to stand up for what's right, to defend the vulnerable, to see Christ in everyone. That's what I was doing. By defying me? By defending a stranger? By defending someone who was trying to do something good and being judged unfairly for it." I sat down across from him. "Daddy, when did we become the Pharisees instead of the people Jesus actually spent time with?" He flinched. "That's not fair, Grace. Isn't it? You didn't even consider accepting Jake's donation. You didn't ask why he was giving or what it might mean to him. You just assumed the worst because he's an outsider." My father was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edges of his Bible. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. "I'm afraid, Grace. Afraid of losing you to a world I've tried so hard to protect you from. You can't protect me from life, Daddy. You can only prepare me for it. And you did, you taught me about compassion, integrity, and faith. Trust those teachings." We didn't resolve everything that night. Healing rarely happens in a single conversation. But we'd started something, a dialogue instead of a monologue, a relationship instead of a dictatorship. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I'd never experienced. I'd been living my life in fear, fear of judgment, fear of disappointment, fear of being less than perfect. But perfection wasn't the point. Authenticity was. I found Jake at the ranch that afternoon, mending a fence in the back pasture. When he saw me approaching, he set down his tools and waited, that patient way he had of giving people space to find their words. "I need to tell you something," I said, slightly breathless from the walk. "Last night wasn't about rebellion or acting out. It was about finally being honest, with my father, with myself, and with you." "I know," he said simply. "The town is going to talk. My father is going to struggle with this. It's not going to be easy. Worth things rarely are." I smiled at that. "I'm not looking for someone to rescue me from my life, Jake. I'm looking for someone who will walk beside me while I figure out who I really am." He stepped closer, his eyes serious. "Grace, I'm still figuring out who I am too. I'm still healing. I can't promise you some fairy tale." "Good," I said. "Because I don't want a fairy tale. I want something real." Over the following weeks, Jake and I built something quietly revolutionary, a friendship first, rooted in honesty and mutual respect. We'd meet for coffee at the diner, take walks along the creek, sit on his truck tailgate and talk about everything from theology to horse medicine to our favorite books. The town watched, and yes, they gossiped. But something interesting happened. Jake started opening up more at church, joining the men's Bible study group. He shared his story, the loss, the grief, the searching, and his vulnerability gave others permission to be vulnerable too. Marcus Chin shared about his struggles with anxiety. Tommy Rodriguez talked about nearly losing his marriage. Even my father seemed affected, his sermons becoming less about rules and more about grace. And I started finding my own voice. I enrolled in online courses for social work instead of teaching, drawn to helping people on the margins. I started a support group at church for young adults struggling with questions about faith and identity. I learned that being good didn't mean being perfect or pleasing everyone, it meant being true to your values even when it was uncomfortable. 3 months after that fateful night, something remarkable happened. The church roof fund had finally reached its goal, thanks in large part to Jake's initial donation and the matching gifts it had inspired. At the Sunday service, my father did something unprecedented. He called Jake forward. "Jake Holloway," my father said from the pulpit, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you an apology. When you first offered to help this church, I responded with suspicion instead of gratitude. I let fear and judgment cloud my response to genuine generosity. The congregation was silent, riveted. My father never apologized publicly. You've taught this community, and especially this preacher, an important lesson about grace. Real grace isn't conditional. It doesn't require people to prove themselves worthy first. It meets people where they are and believes the best about them. He paused, his eyes finding mine in the front pew. My daughter tried to tell me that, and I wasn't ready to hear it. But I'm listening now. There wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary. Jake, standing at the front, looked uncomfortable with the attention but touched by the words. When he returned to his seat, not in the back anymore, but in the third pew, he caught my hand briefly and squeezed it. That afternoon, my parents invited Jake to Sunday dinner for the first time. It was awkward initially, filled with careful small talk and long pauses. But then my mother asked Jake about his veterinary work, and he started telling stories about the animals he treated, the three-legged dog who'd become a therapy animal, the rescued horse that learned to trust again, the barn cat that adopted a litter of orphaned kittens. My father listened, really listened, and I saw something shift in his face. He was seeing Jake not as a threat or a stranger, but as a person, someone with gifts and wounds and a story of his own. You know, my father said slowly, we've been talking about starting a blessing of the animal service, like some of the bigger churches do. Would you consider helping with that? Jake looked genuinely surprised. I'd be honored, sir. After dinner, Jake and I walked down to the creek that ran behind my parents' property. The autumn sun painted everything gold, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely at peace with who I was. Thank you, Jake said quietly. For what? For seeing me when I was trying to be invisible. For standing up when it cost you something. For showing me that healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means learning to live fully again. I leaned against his shoulder, this gentle giant who'd helped me find my courage. You did the same for me. You showed me that being good isn't about following someone else's script. It's about being brave enough to live with integrity. He turned to me then, his hand cupping my face with a tenderness that made my breath catch. Grace Elizabeth Morrison, you are the bravest person I know. When he kissed me, it wasn't forbidden or wrong or anything the judgmental voices had tried to make it. It was honest and sweet and exactly right. 6 months later, standing in that same church, wearing my mother's wedding dress with wildflowers in my hair, I married Jake Holloway. My father performed the ceremony, his voice strong and sure as he spoke about love that transforms, faith that questions, and grace that covers all. But the real story isn't the wedding, it's what came before and what came after. It's about a young woman who learned that being good doesn't mean being silent, that questioning isn't the opposite of faith, and that sometimes the most righteous thing you can do is follow your heart even when it terrifies you. Jake and I opened a combined veterinary practice and animal sanctuary outside Redemption Creek. We take in wounded creatures, both animal and human, and give them space to heal. My father stops by regularly, and he and Jake have become genuine friends, bound by their shared understanding of grace and second chances. The town still talks about us sometimes, the preacher's daughter and the drifting cowboy who found each other. But now they tell our story differently. They tell it as a reminder that redemption comes in unexpected packages, that love can heal old wounds, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone truly see you. I learned that good girls don't follow every rule without question. Good girls, good people, follow their conscience, stand up for what's right, and have the courage to be authentic even when it's terrifying. That forbidden night wasn't about breaking rules for the thrill of it. It was about breaking free from the prison of other people's expectations and finding the courage to live truthfully.